Hey, last week we were in chapter 5 of the Gospel of John, and we were looking here at the teaching that Jesus gave concerning his identity following the healing of the lame man in Jerusalem, at the pool in Jerusalem. And that had concluded with Jesus beginning to face some opposition, and they object to Jesus doing this miracle on the Sabbath. They said that he was breaking the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath. But then also they were concerned about Jesus' claim when he said, "My Father is working still, and I am working." So they brought this charge against Jesus, and they were attempting to kill him because not only did he break the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And we looked at that long section of teaching last week from John chapter 5, verse 19 through to the end of the chapter, in which Jesus talks about his identity and his relationship with the Father and calls upon various witnesses to testify to his identity. We move on to chapter 6 this evening, and the scene changes now in this chapter. So we'll read chapter 6, verses 1 to 15 to begin with here. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a multitude followed him because they saw the signs which he did on those who were diseased. Jesus went up on the mountain and there sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a multitude was coming to him, Jesus said to Philip, "How are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." And there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign which he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So this is the account that John gives us of this sign, this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And it's part of this long chapter, which goes through to verse 71, 71 verses in John chapter 6, in which we have the feeding of the 5,000, and then another long section of teaching from Jesus concerning his identity as the bread of life. But the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle, apart from the resurrection of Jesus himself, which is recorded by all 4 gospel writers. And it's a well-known story, a well-loved story, one that's often taught to children in Sunday school classes, but one that is equally interesting and useful for us as well. Back in chapter 5, Jesus had been in Jerusalem. That's where the healing of the lame man had taken place. Jesus had gone there for a feast of the Jews, we were told. But now in chapter 6, Jesus is back in Galilee. So verse 1 of the chapter here says, "After this." So there's this referring to an indefinite period of time between chapter 5, the events of chapter 5, and chapter 6. So at this time, Jesus has left Jerusalem and Judea. He's gone back north to Galilee. And at some unspecified time, then Jesus decided to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The lake in Galilee is referred to um, here by two names, by the Sea of Galilee and also the Sea of Tiberias. Verse 1 there says that after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. In 20 AD, the town of Tiberias had been built on the western shore of the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and it was named after the Emperor Tiberius. So the lake then took its name from the town. John uses that name again in chapter 21, verse 11, verse 1, right at the end of his gospel there, at the resurrection appearance of Jesus. He says, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. So that's a name that John seems to favour for the Sea of Galilee here. The Sea of Galilee then would probably have been an earlier name for this lake, and then after the building of that town, it would probably be known as the Sea of Tiberias as well. There are some other names that are used for the Sea of Galilee. In the Old Testament, it's referred to as Chinnereth in Numbers chapter 34, verse 11, and also as Chinneroth in Joshua chapter 12, verse 3. And there's another name for it in Luke's Gospel, in Luke chapter 5, verse 1, where it's referred to as the Lake of Gennesaret. So various names are used of what we commonly think of as the Sea of Galilee. From verse 2 of our reading, we see the reason why people were following Jesus to the place he had gone to. Verse 2 says, a multitude followed him because they saw the signs which he did on those who were diseased. The tense here denotes continuous action, that they kept following him because he kept doing signs, these signs for those who were sick or diseased. Although John doesn't really record many of the miracles of healing, it is clear that from what he says here that Jesus did heal many people. And once again here we see John uses the word signs for these miracles, that they're signs because they point to something, they point to some spiritual truth as well. So Jesus had gone over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he'd gone up onto a mountain with his disciples. And this great crowd of people, this multitude, had followed him there because of these signs that they knew he was doing, that they'd seen him do. In Luke's account of this, which is in Luke chapter 9, verse 10, Luke tells us that they had gone to Bethsaida. And if we go back to that map, you can see Bethsaida on the map there. So you've got Capernaum at the northern end, and further around there is Bethsaida. So that's where Jesus has gone to. And Bethsaida was the hometown of Philip, Andrew, and Simon Peter as well. So that's their hometown there. Matthew, in his account, which is Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, tells us that Jesus travelled there by boat, but the crowds had followed on foot around the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And from Mark's account in Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 32, we learn that Jesus and his disciples had gone there so that they could be alone and have a time of rest. However, this plan for them to be alone didn't really work out, as the crowd soon found out where Jesus was, and they followed him around the lake to Bethsaida. John adds the note here that this happened at the time of the Passover. He says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. The Passover was held in sort of March, April, end of March, beginning of April time, according to our calendar. So we know roughly the time of year when this incident took place. And this is the second Passover that John has referred to in his gospel. And there's a third Passover to come which would be Jesus' final Passover, the Passover when his ministry comes to an end and his death takes place at the final Passover. So this is the second of these three Passovers that John records. From Matthew's account of this, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 14, we learn that Jesus healed those in the crowd who were sick. And from Mark's account, Mark chapter 6, verses 34 to 36, we learn that Jesus took this opportunity to teach the people as well. So Jesus is involved both in a healing ministry, healing those in the crowd who are sick, but also he is teaching them as well. And it was late in the day when the question arose over what the people were to eat. When we read John's account, if we didn't have the other accounts, it all seems to happen rather quickly. But from the other accounts, we learn that this is something that has been going on all day. The people have been there for a long time throughout the day, listening to Jesus teach and for Jesus to do these healings as well. So it's late in the day when the question of what they were to eat arose. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts, it's the disciples who come to Jesus with the suggestion that the crowd should be sent away in order to buy food in the nearby towns and villages. But here in John's account, we see that it is Jesus himself who raises the matter of food. We're told here in verse 5, seeing that a multitude was coming to him, Jesus said to Philip, "How are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" So it's Jesus who raises that question to begin with. How are we going to buy bread so that the people can eat? And verse 6 makes it clear that Jesus already knew what he would do and that he had asked this question in order to test Philip. Verse 6 there again says, this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So what was it then that Jesus was testing by asking this question? Or perhaps he's testing Philip's ability to see that Jesus could supply every need. If Jesus already knew what he was going to do, what does Philip think about this situation? Can Philip see the possibility of Jesus supplying this need? But Philip's answer reveals what he saw to be the hopelessness of this situation. Philip says 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. A denarius was a day's wage for a labourer. So 200 denarii would be 200 days' wages, roughly, suppose 6 months, eight months worth of wages. So there are so many people present that even if they did have this 200 denarii, that would not be enough to buy sufficient food for all of these people. So this is how Philip is looking at the situation, and he sees it as being hopeless. So there's so many people here. There's no way that we would have enough money to be able to buy food to feed them all. Well, Andrew then turns up on the scene, and he's introduced to us again here. We've met Andrew back in chapter 1 before, and once again we're reminded that he is Simon Peter's brother, and he draws attention to a young boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But like Philip, Andrew also sees the hopelessness of the situation, that these 5 barley loaves and 2 fish would never feed so many people. John is the only one of the gospel writers to tell us that these loaves were barley loaves, which is a cheap form of food. And the word he uses for fish here means a small fish. This is a very small amount of food that the boy has. So the loaves and the fish was just a cheap, basic meal. It's one boy's lunch that he's brought out for this occasion. So the limitations or in the disciples' faith is seen here in the reaction of both Philip and Andrew. They both see the situation as hopeless and impossible. The problem of providing food for so many people is one that cannot be overcome. They don't have enough money to buy food for everyone, and there isn't enough food that they already have to be shared amongst so many people. So instead of looking to Jesus to solve this problem, they looked to themselves and to their own resources and saw, well, this is beyond us. We're unable to provide an answer to this problem of feeding these people. But Jesus, as we've been told, knew what he was going to do, and he now instructed the disciples to get the people seated. In verse 10, he says, "Make the people sit down." And John mentions here that there was much grass in the place, perhaps sort of an indication, a detail that perhaps would have been observed by an eyewitness that John was there and he'd noticed that there was much grass in this place. So we shouldn't think of this as being some sort of desert area where they had gone to, but there's plenty of grass in the place. Probably that would make it more on the grass rather than on sand or rough sort of ground. And the number of men is given here as being about 5,000. Luke, in his account of this, tells us that they were seated in groups of 50. And Matthew, chapter 14, verse 21, tells us that there were women and children who were present in addition to the 5,000 men. So not just 5,000, but women and children also being present, which perhaps put the number up to something like 10,000 or even 15,000, depending on how many women and children were there as well. So Jesus then took these loaves, the boys' loaves, and he gave thanks, thanking God for the food, and he distributed them to the people. And he did the same with the fish as well. And we're told here that the people were then able to receive as much as they wanted. So they had plenty to eat. The miracle itself is recorded very briefly and simply. There's no elaboration of how it occurred, just the basic fact that it happened, similar to the way in which the miracle of turning the water into wine was described as well. No great elaboration on any details at all, but simply that this is what happened. And in doing this, Jesus has bypassed the process of bread production. Normally, you plant the seed of the wheat and it grows and then it's harvested and then it has to go through the process of being turned into flour and the bread making process. Well, all of that is bypassed simply by Jesus distributing it, performing this sign, this miracle in this way. Luke chapter 9 and verse 16 provides further details that Jesus broke the bread and the fish, and that it was then the disciples who distributed the food to the people. So it's a very restrained account that John gives us of the details, and the other gospel accounts are also restrained in that way as well. There's differences in the detail, but always it's very briefly, simply recorded. So when the people had finished eating and everyone had had enough to eat, so plenty of food for everyone, Jesus instructed his disciples then to gather up the fragments left over that nothing may be lost. So although Jesus had provided this abundant supply of food, there was to be no wastefulness. So the fragments were to be gathered up, and the fragments filled 12 baskets, we're told. We then see the reaction of the people to this sign in verse 14. They say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." They believed that Jesus was the prophet who had been spoken of by Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 18. We have a read of that, Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 to 19. This was the one everyone was expecting. The Lord, Moses says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren, him you shall heed, just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they have rightly said all that they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. This is something that the people had been looking forward to, this prophet who would be raised up by the Lord, one who would be like Moses. And now, in seeing what Jesus has done here, these people are thinking that Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. So they believe that Jesus was this prophet who had been spoken of by Moses, the one that the Lord would raise up. We see here that there's a different attitude amongst the Galileans to those who were in Jerusalem, as we saw in chapter 5, and the opposition that arose to Jesus there and their hostility towards Jesus. Here in Galilee, they seem more accepting of Jesus and recognizing him as that prophet. Jesus could see the effect that this was having upon the people, and that they now wanted to take him by force to make him their king. So they wanted to now force him to become the kind of king that they wanted him to be, not knowing that he was already a king, didn't need to be made a king, he was already a king. And they also failed to understand the nature of his kingship and the nature of his kingdom. And so because of this unwanted reaction, then Jesus withdrew to a mountain to be by himself. So the significance of this miracle, of this sign, really is the spiritual truth conveyed through the sign. And that will be seen in the discourse that follows this in verses 22 to 59, in which Jesus makes that claim to be the bread of life. As he's provided them with the physical bread, which will satisfy their physical hunger. But Jesus is more than that. He is the bread of life, and he can make that spiritual provision for them. But we'll see more of that next week when we get into that passage and we see the significance, the importance of this miracle. There is one more incident to mention here, verses 16 to 21. Which says this, verse 16 to 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea rose because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened, but he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. This incident of the walking on the water is also recorded by Matthew. It's in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, and it's in Mark as well, Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. Luke doesn't record this. Matthew's and Mark's accounts of this are more detailed than John's account, and Matthew's is the most detailed of all, which includes Peter walking on the water towards Jesus before he takes his eyes off Jesus and then begins to sink into the sea. So that's it's only Matthew who records that part of the story. John's account, as we see here, is quite short and quite brief. John doesn't call this a sign, as he's referred to the other miracles as sign, but we certainly to understand it to be a miracle, a sign, despite the views of some of the commentators who say that, well, Jesus was simply walking along the seashore, or it was a low tide and the sandbank that Jesus was walking upon. So this is a miracle. It is the 5th sign of the 7 that John records here in his gospel. John's account is condensed, as we said, a brief account, but from Matthew and Mark, we learn that Jesus sent his disciples away in the boat to go to the other side of the lake before he dismissed the crowd, and then he went up on the mountain by himself in order to pray. It may be that Jesus is sending his disciples away so that they don't get caught up and influenced by the crowd who wanted to make Jesus their king. That with all of that going on, perhaps the disciples could get caught up in all of that excitement that was going on and going along with the crowds in their demand that Jesus should become king. And so in order to protect them from that, then Jesus sends them off by themselves in the boat, whilst he dismisses the crowd and he goes up the mountain to pray by himself. The disciples then set off to Capernaum, and by this time we're told that it was dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. Not that they were expecting him, but simply told here that they're alone and Jesus is alone on the mountain. Verse 18 then records the storm that arose. The verse says, the sea rose because a strong wind was blowing. Matthew, chapter 14, verse 24, notes that the boat was now many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And Mark, in Mark chapter 6, verse 48, says, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Jesus was able to observe what was going on from the mountain, and he could see that they were in difficulty. They were making headway painfully because the wind was against them. They're trying to row this boat against the wind, and so they're really struggling with that. The Sea of Galilee, although it's a small, we call it a sea, but it's more like a lake. It's just 13 miles long and between 6 and 7 miles wide. So this Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee, was renowned for its sudden, violent storms. It's located 682 feet below the level of the Mediterranean Sea, and it's surrounded by hills with valleys and gorges through which the wind is funneled, creating these violent storms on the lake. And here is one of those occasions when this storm arises. So here, on this occasion, the disciples are caught in one of those storms, and they're struggling against the wind as they try to row from east to west. But from his place on the mountain, Jesus could see the difficulty that they were in. John tells us that the disciples had rowed 3 or 4 miles when Jesus came near to them walking on the sea. Literally, the text says that they were 25 to 30 stadia. A stadia was a measurement of distance that the Romans used. One stadia was the length of a stadium, which was about 165 meters long. Changing it to our miles, it works out as being about 3 or 4 miles that they've rowed, and then Jesus came to them walking on the sea. Matthew and Mark tell us the time of this happening, that it was at the 4th watch of the night, and that's between 3 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning. So they've been out there rowing for several hours, and they've not really made much progress, 3 to 4 miles, and then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. When the disciples saw Jesus, they were frightened. Matthew and Mark provide the reason for their fear, that they thought they had seen a ghost. They were not expecting to see Jesus there at that moment. And then Matthew goes into the account of Peter wanting to get out of the boat and walk to Jesus. So we have that in Matthew's account. But here, back in John's account in verse 20, Jesus then spoke to them in order to reassure them that it was him. He says, "It is I, do not be afraid." Literally, he says, "I am. do not be afraid. For us, when he uses the word I am, we're reminded of how God described himself to Moses at the burning bush. Whether the disciples cottoned on to that is perhaps we don't know. But he says, I am, do not be afraid. And then, as you say, Matthew adds the account of Peter walking on the water. Verse 21 then records the end of the voyage, the journey. We're told here that the disciples were glad to receive Jesus into the boat, welcome, and then immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Some see in that description there another miracle, that as soon as Jesus got into the boat, they were at land. That need not necessarily be the case. It may simply describe the speedy end of the journey. We don't need to necessarily interpret that as being a miracle. Matthew and Mark both tell us that when Jesus got into the boat, the wind ceased, which would then enable them to complete their journey with ease. So it would seem that they had very quickly then got to the land to which they were going. Well, what lessons can we learn from this sort of unusual, intriguing incident of Jesus walking on the water? Perhaps we learn that Jesus is to be found when least expected. The disciples were not expecting to see Jesus when they're struggling there on the lake, and suddenly he's there. And for us, Jesus is with us even when we are unaware of his presence, that he is there, that he cares for us through the storms of life. He could see the disciples and how they were struggling in that storm, and he went to them, went to be with them. There's a nice passage in one of the Psalms which fits in with all of this, in Psalm 107, verses 23 to 30. And when we read this, we can perhaps picture what the disciples were going through there in that storm. Psalm 107, verse 23 says, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. Reeled and staggered like drunken men, and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to the sons of men. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people, and praise him in the assembly of the elders. The psalmist is describing there those who are caught in a storm at sea, and the trouble that they're facing, the fear they experience. But they cry to the Lord for help, and he delivers them, and the storm is stilled, and he brings them to their desired haven. And that's what Jesus did here with the disciples caught in that storm, struggling in that storm, that he came to them walking on the sea, and then brought them to the land to which they were going. So we learn a lesson here on the presence of Jesus, that Jesus is with us through those difficult times. We learn also of Jesus' authority over nature, just as he showed his authority when he multiplied the loaves and the fishes. Here we see his authority over nature, that he can walk on water, he can walk on the sea, and he can bring calm to the storms as well. A few things to think about from tonight's lesson. Compare the different accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. We mentioned that that this is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and then if you do that, notice the differences. What are some of the differences that you notice in those accounts, the differences in the details? And by reading all 4 accounts, it gives us a fuller picture of what happened. And how would you have reacted if you had been present, if you'd been one of those thousands of people there who benefited from that? What would have your reaction been to all of that? And then what sort of king were the crowds hoping that Jesus would be? They wanted to take him and force him to be king. What were they hoping from that? And then what was Jesus doing by walking on the water? What was that all about? Why did he do that? What was he teaching them? So a few things for us to think about from this. And then for next week, we'll continue here in chapter 6, go into the teaching that Jesus gives concerning himself as the bread of life. So we will stop here.